I've got to do something for my own mental health, for my wife's, and for Archie's as well, because I could see where this was headed.
Just when the world thought the saga couldn't turn darker, a stunning twist erupts from behind palace walls. With a custody deal finally sealed, Prince Harry breaks his silence, and what he alleges sends shockwaves far beyond Montecito. In a move no one saw coming, he turned his focus toward Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew, leveling accusations so disturbing they threatened to rewrite everything we thought we knew. So, is this desperation, strategy, or the start of a truth the royal family prayed would never surface fully? The dawn, the crown moved, without a sound. At first light on February 3rd, while cities breathed softly in sleep and headlines lay dormant, a decision was made inside the British crown that had not been taken in living memory. It arrived without drama and without witnesses. There were no flashing cameras, no urgent press briefings, no official words chosen with surgical care. On the surface, it appeared almost routine, a quiet administrative move, a minor adjustment buried deep within protocol. But beneath that calm exterior, something extraordinary had happened. 2 passports were quietly locked. They did not belong to criminals on the run or figures under investigation. They belonged to 2 children, young, innocent, and born into one of the most watched families on the planet. Children whose lives had already unfolded beneath a magnifying glass, whether they chose it or not. In royal language, the act was understated. In constitutional reality, it was an earthquake. Freezing a child's passport is one of the crown's most discreet powers, and also one of its most serious. It is not used to punish. It is not used to threaten. It is used only when the institution believes something essential has been compromised, when a child's safety, identity, or future continuity is perceived to be at risk. Once that internal conclusion is reached, the process does not pause to negotiate emotions or public opinion. It moves forward quietly and decisively, and it rarely turns back. For Harry, the impact landed not as a loud shock, but as a slow, disorienting unraveling. He believed the worst was behind them. The public storm had burned itself out. A custody agreement had been signed. Legal teams had stepped aside. The tension surrounding his children no longer dominated the headlines. Conversations had shifted toward cautious cooperation, parallel parenting, structured boundaries, and a shared understanding that the children deserved peace, even if the adults never fully found it. There were moments when that peace even felt real. Phone calls became calmer. The urgency faded. The sense of being constantly braced for impact began to loosen. It seemed, finally, like the system had chosen stability over spectacle, like the long chapter of conflict was closing, page by page. What Harry did not see, what he could not see, was that another process had been unfolding silently alongside it all. Because the crown does not react to noise, it reacts to patterns. It does not move based on public apologies or temporary agreements, but on deeper assessments that take time to form. By the time its decisions surface, they are rarely impulsive. They are the final step of a long, unseen review. And so, while the outside world spoke of healing and progress, the institution had already reached a different conclusion. The frozen passports were not a warning shot. They were a statement, a line drawn without explanation, a signal that, in the eyes of the crown, the story was not stabilizing. It was deteriorating. For Harry, the realization was devastating, not because of what was taken, but because of what it meant. Time itself seemed to turn against him. The idea that moving on had been enough collapsed instantly. The fragile calm he believed in revealed itself for what it truly was: a pause, not a resolution. Peace had not arrived. It had merely been waiting. What did the palace say about the seized passports? How did the children's school and hospital react to the whole thing? Let's find out. When silence became the loudest warning. The palace trembled not from scandal or conflict, but from a deliberate, unsettling silence. Carefully measured pauses that spoke louder than words, leaving an eerie tension hanging in every corner. Messages that once drew immediate replies were left hanging, unanswered. Emails that had always sparked prompt attention now disappeared into the void. Schools that had once communicated freely with ease were met with polite deflections at first, and eventually with nothing at all. Doctors reported appointments cancelled without reason, no follow-up offered, no attempts to rearrange. Court mediators, the very people meant to balance disputes and ensure fairness, found their paths completely blocked. The channels that had once been reliable, channels that had existed for years, didn't merely falter, they simply vanished. It was as though someone had pressed pause on the world, leaving the palace surrounded not by noise or chaos, but by an eerie emptiness. Every unanswered call, every ignored message, every vanished opportunity combined into a force far more unnerving than any outburst, the chilling power of silence, chosen with intent and wielded with precision. At first, no single incident seemed alarming. Families change schools all the time. Medical appointments get cancelled for countless reasons. Schedules shift, priorities change, life happens. Each event, taken on its own, had a reasonable explanation. But inside the palace, a troubling pattern was forming. Education went quiet. Healthcare oversight disappeared. Legal communication stalled, all at once. When systems that are meant to protect a child's stability, learning, health, and legal care break down at the same time, coincidence becomes harder to believe. What had once felt like a series of harmless adjustments began to look like something else entirely. And suspicion crept in where reassurance used to live. Behind the closed doors of Windsor, the tone began to shift. Advisors stopped using soft language. This was no longer described as a private family matter or a delicate custody arrangement. New words entered the conversation, colder and more clinical: identity risk, emotional displacement, potential erasure. These were not words chosen lightly. They suggested more than disorganization. They hinted at a child slowly being cut off from familiar routines, trusted professionals, and even from a sense of who they were and where they belonged. Silence, it seemed, was doing the work that open conflict could not. As briefings moved up the chain, the concern deepened. When senior advisors finally sat with Prince William, they did not present a list of isolated problems. They presented a pattern, a timeline, a narrowing circle of access. By that point, the palace had already moved past its first question. This was no longer about whether the communication breakdown was accidental. The real question was far heavier. Was this silence intentional? Inside royal systems, that question changes everything. Silence stops being neutral. It becomes an action. And once silence is understood as a strategy rather than a mistake, patience quickly runs out. Royal institutions are built on continuity, visibility, and accountability. When all three are quietly undermined, alarms are triggered, even without raised voices or dramatic scenes. No one needed a confrontation to see that something was wrong. The absence itself had become the loudest signal. And when silence is no longer seen as harmless, it is no longer tolerated. Because in the palace, silence is not empty. It speaks. And once it does, the system responds. What was the first thing that exposed the game to the public? How did it unfold? Let's delve into the details of how and why the school aired her concern. The school that broke the illusion. The first sign that something unusual was unfolding didn't come from royal courtyards, flashing cameras, or carefully worded statements. It appeared quietly, almost unnoticed, from a place far removed from palaces and politics, a modest school in California, thousands of miles away. On January 31st, the new term began with usual bustle, teachers prepping, students arriving. But two desks stood empty, as Archie and Lilibet, once familiar names, were mysteriously absent. At first, it seemed trivial. Children miss school all the time. Families travel, routines shift, and early term absences rarely spark concern. Yet as the minutes passed and the morning ticked on, a quiet unease began to take hold. The pattern, subtle at first, grew impossible to ignore. Something was off, something beyond the ordinary rhythm of school life. And though no one could yet say what it meant, the silence of those empty seats was the first hint of a story about to unfold, one that would ripple far beyond those sunlit classrooms. There had been no email from a parent explaining the absence. No formal withdrawal notice had been filed. There was no request to transfer the children to another school. No records indicating where their education would continue. No plan outlining homeschooling or remote learning. Nothing at all to suggest continuity. By late morning, the school administration grew uneasy. Protocol required action. Phone calls were placed to the listed guardians. Voicemails were left, emails followed, polite at first, then increasingly urgent. There was no reply. Even outreach through representatives produced silence. When the school contacted the court-appointed mediator associated with the family, the response was the same. There was no record of any approved change. That was the moment everything shifted. In child protection systems, there is a line that separates privacy from public responsibility. Once children disappear from an official educational system without explanation, and once their guardians cannot be reached, the issue moves beyond family choice. It becomes a safeguarding concern. By early afternoon, that line had been crossed. As the day faded into evening, the matter escalated. International child welfare channels were notified, not because of who the children were, but because of what was missing. Investigators began to search for basic indicators that normally accompany family movement. They found none. There were no travel filings, no immigration updates, no change of residence records, no declarations of homeschooling, which are legally required in many jurisdictions. Even more troubling were the medical records. Routine pediatric appointments had been canceled, cleanly, completely. There were no rescheduled dates, no referrals to new doctors, no transfer of care to alternative providers. To trained professionals, this absence of activity spoke loudly. Families in crisis leave traces. Even rushed decisions create paperwork, messages, and mistakes. Chaos has a signature. This did not. What investigators saw instead was precision. Systems disengaged one by one, without replacement or transition. To child welfare experts, the meaning was clear and deeply unsettling. This was not a case of confusion or poor planning. It was a deliberate retreat, a slow, careful pulling away from every structure designed to track, protect, and support children. By nightfall, the concern was no longer about missed school days. It was about children who had quietly slipped out of sight, without explanation, without continuity, and without a single confirmed point of contact left behind. At what point did the palace take hold of the situation? Who were those who gathered to salvage the situation? Let's dive into the details of the palace's move to address the situation. The red folder that ended all debate. The emergency meeting at Windsor Castle came out of nowhere, like a sudden storm on an otherwise calm day. There were no prior calls, no carefully arranged schedules, no gentle explanations. One moment, the castle hummed with ordinary activity. The next, senior officials were being guided briskly through heavily guarded doors, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. At the entrance, every phone was taken, not just silenced, but completely confiscated. Personal assistants were sent away without a word. Doors were closed with quiet finality. No agenda was handed out. No briefing notes were distributed. The air itself seemed to tighten with tension. Every small detail, the clipped instructions, the absence of paperwork, the palpable hush, shouted a single, unmistakable message. This was no routine meeting. Within the stone walls, whispers of speculation could almost be heard, though none dared to speak them aloud. Faces exchanged fleeting glances, each silently asking the same question. What could possibly have triggered such abrupt secrecy? The sense of urgency, the absolute control over information, and the sheer unexpectedness created an atmosphere thick with suspense. This was a gathering meant to command attention, to convey that something extraordinary, perhaps even shocking, was unfolding behind those locked doors. Princess Anne entered the room carrying a thick red folder. Its weight was obvious, not just in size, but in meaning. She remained standing. No one asked her to sit. No one else moved. The folder was sealed and stamped with language rarely seen outside the gravest constitutional moments. The words were precise, cold, and unmistakable. Immediate custodial breach, maternal withdrawal. When the seal was broken, the room seemed to tighten. Inside were documents gathered from multiple systems that normally operate separately. Education authorities, medical institutions, legal oversight bodies, and intelligence advisors. Each had reached the same conclusions independently. Then, together, they had verified the findings. The first section detailed school removals carried out without notice, children withdrawn abruptly, with no transition plans, no educational handover, and no safeguarding reviews. Teachers reported sudden disappearances. Administrators confirmed they were given no explanation. The next set of pages addressed medical care. Appointments canceled mid-treatment. Records requested but never transferred. Ongoing care interrupted, with no replacement doctors named and no continuity ensured. Standard safeguarding protocols had been bypassed entirely. Then came the legal findings. Scheduled communications had been blocked. Court-approved channels were ignored. Messages from guardians and representatives were left unanswered. Legal access had not simply failed, it had been actively obstructed. The room remained quiet as the financial documents were revealed. A long-established education trust fund, worth millions and created specifically to secure the children's future schooling, had been quietly dissolved. The funds had been redirected elsewhere. There were no new trusts, no alternative plans, no provisions set aside in their place. The safety net had not been replaced. It had been removed. But the final document changed the temperature of the room. It was an intelligence memo, and it made one thing painfully clear. None of this was accidental. The memo outlined months of deliberate preparation, contracts focused on personal reinvention, written requests to remove all family ties from professional records, instructions to ensure the children's names and images would never again appear in future media projects or public narratives. This was not chaos. It was a strategy. One advisor, breaking the silence at last, summarized the findings in a single sentence that hung heavily in the air. "This is not co-parenting," they said. "This is erasure." There were no arguments after that. No debates. No calls for further review. The evidence spoke clearly enough on its own. In that moment, the nature of the meeting changed. What began as an assessment ended as a decision. The Crown no longer observed from a distance. It stepped forward. The shift was subtle, but absolute. The time for watching had passed. The time for action had begun. What and how did the palace handle the whole situation? Were they able to achieve seamless success? Let's dig into the details of the Crown's decisive efforts. Intervention without applause or mercy. The Crown did not enter into debate. There were no back-and-forth conversations, no bargaining, no attempts to reach a middle ground. Instead, it acted with quiet certainty. What unfolded was not a negotiation, but an intervention, measured, lawful, and resolute. At the heart of this action was a constitutional clause that had long existed but rarely been used. It was designed for moments of grave concern, when royal children risk losing not just physical security, but a clear sense of identity, continuity, and belonging. That provision allows the Crown to step in as guardian when minors face displacement, confusion of status, or effective abandonment of their constitutional and historical position. After careful consideration, the decision to invoke it was unanimous. There was no drama in the room, no raised voices or visible tension. The weight of the moment was understood by all present. These were not ordinary circumstances, and the stakes were far higher than public opinion or political convenience. Within hours of the decision, practical steps followed swiftly and quietly. The children's passports were secured to ensure clarity of jurisdiction and prevent sudden or unauthorized movement. Commercial use of their names, images, and personal narratives was immediately prohibited, drawing a firm boundary between childhood and exploitation. A restoration fund was also established, its purpose not symbolic, but deeply practical. It was designed to stabilize the children's education, provide consistent emotional support, and ensure access to professional care where needed. The focus was on continuity, routine, and protection. Evidence was reviewed carefully and without commentary. Documents, timelines, expert assessments, and private reports were examined in silence. When the review was complete, the monarch spoke only once. The words were brief, but unmistakably clear. "This is no longer about adults. It is about protecting two children, emotionally, legally, and historically." Those words reframed everything. Personal grievances, public narratives, and competing loyalties fell away. What remained was responsibility. Prince Harry formally requested temporary custodial authority. His request was not dismissed casually, nor was it treated as an act of defiance. It was reviewed according to established procedure. The conclusion was procedural rather than personal. Guardianship, under constitutional standards, requires three things: stability, clear jurisdiction, and demonstrable capacity. At that specific moment in time, the Crown determined that all three could not be assured. As a result, the request was declined. No condemnation followed. No moral judgment was attached. The decision was framed strictly within institutional duty. Notably, there was no press conference. No official statement was issued. No effort was made to manage public reaction or shape headlines. The silence was intentional. The Crown understood that spectacle would undermine the very principle it was acting to uphold. This was not about appearances. It was about protection. In the absence of explanation, speculation flourished, but that too was accepted as the cost of restraint. The intervention was not punishment, retaliation, or control. It was the execution of a responsibility that predates any individual and outlasts any controversy. In choosing silence over performance, the Crown reaffirmed a core truth. When the welfare of children is at stake, duty does not need applause. It only needs resolve. Did the royal family eventually take full custody of the royal kids? What was the final judgment on the custody deal? Let's find out what ended the custody deal. Anchoring the children while the world looked elsewhere. While the formalities of law ground themselves in rigid routines, a quieter, almost invisible drama was unfolding within the walls of Windsor. The legal battles, the judgments, the paperwork, all those public and unforgiving wheels of authority continued elsewhere. But inside those ancient stones, life moved at a slower, steadier pace. Routine returned. Days regained structure. Lessons, once punctuated by uncertainty, resumed as they had always been meant to. Predictable, comforting, grounding. Play returned too, not as a scheduled activity or a performance to impress, but as something children simply did, without agenda, without scrutiny, without expectation. Experts and specialists were no longer there to dissect or explain, but to calm, to reassure, to quietly restore faith in the normal rhythms of childhood. Stability did not arrive in grand gestures or sweeping proclamations. It arrived in the small, persistent acts of daily life, repeated until they became unshakable. Princess Catherine entered this delicate space with no fanfare, no public statement, no announcement. Her presence was deliberate but restrained, a quiet force ensuring that emotional continuity remained unbroken. There were no staged smiles, no orchestrated photo opportunities, no attempts at spectacle. There was simply someone standing quietly at the helm, guiding without announcing her hand. Only a single photograph slipped into public view, without caption, without commentary. It captured Lilibet, tiny and steady, walking out of Windsor Chapel hand in hand with Princess Charlotte. For an outsider, it seemed like a gentle, almost ordinary moment. But for those who knew the layers beneath, the photograph carried a quiet power. It spoke of control regained, of direction restored. The children, once adrift in a world of uncertainty, were no longer floating. They had been anchored. The judgments that followed were precise, quiet, and inevitable. Custodial authority, long abused, was stripped away on the grounds of repeated disengagement and obstruction of welfare oversight. Commercial empires built on privilege and secrecy began to crumble. Trusts were frozen. Identities once exposed were placed under permanent protection. And through it all, there were no speeches, no declarations of victory, no language meant to wound or celebrate. Inside Windsor, life simply moved forward. Meals were shared around familiar tables. Gardens were walked in the soft afternoon light. Lessons, both formal and informal, continued. And yet, amid this return to normalcy, one question hovered stubbornly in the air, unanswered, unresolved. Why had the most explosive accusations only surfaced? That question lingers like a shadow, waiting for the light of truth to finally illuminate it. Until it does, the story is far from complete. Actions have been taken. The children are safe. The Crown has asserted its responsibility. Yet the final rupture, the motive behind it, the meaning it carries, the true cost it has exacted, remains suspended in time, poised to emerge only when the full narrative is ready to be told. Within Windsor, the ordinary quietly triumphs over chaos. Life continues, anchored in the rhythms of shared meals, gentle lessons, and the simple, unassuming acts that signal stability. And while the world speculates and wonders, the truth waits, patient and immovable, until the final piece falls into place. Why did Harry accuse Meghan and Andrew? Did the duo have anything in common? Let's delve into the details of the royal storm growing online. The yacht story. The instant Prince Andrew was stripped of his remaining royal roles and public honors, a strange new story began to ripple across the internet. What had once been quiet corners of online gossip suddenly grew loud. Posts multiplied, threads stretched longer, and hushed suggestions turned into bold claims. Many users began to insist that images long kept out of sight, images supposedly linking Andrew to Meghan Markle, were finally emerging. According to these online rumors, the photographs dated back to Meghan's life before royalty, before titles, headlines, and palace walls. Commentators claimed the images showed her aboard a luxury yacht, a setting that immediately raised eyebrows because of Andrew's controversial past and the company he was known to keep. To those sharing the story, this detail felt too striking to ignore. They argued it filled gaps in a narrative that, until now, had never been openly discussed. As the claims spread, the tone shifted from curiosity to conviction. Influencers, small gossip accounts, and anonymous users began echoing one another, presenting the story as a hidden truth rather than simple speculation. Many posts suggested this was not random timing. Instead, they framed Andrew's public fall as the moment when long-standing protections finally vanished, allowing suppressed details to rise to the surface. Screenshots of old posts, loosely built timelines, and repeated captions created the sense that something organized and intentional was unfolding. At the center of the storm was the return of a loaded phrase, "yacht girl." Online commentators used it to describe Meghan's alleged lifestyle during that period of her life. Supporters of the theory claimed the term explained how she might have moved within wealthy, exclusive circles, including those connected to Andrew. The phrase spread quickly, often framed as context rather than accusation, yet it carried heavy implications that fueled further debate. Soon after, older photos began circulating widely. Some were said to show Meghan on yachts with affluent individuals. Others were more indirect, presented as evidence of access to elite spaces linked, at least loosely, to Andrew's social world. The images were often blurry, cropped, or lacking clear details. Still, their constant resharing gave them power. For many users, repetition alone became proof, even when the images themselves offered little clarity. As arguments filled comment sections, the story grew larger than the claims that started it. Past interviews were re-examined. Early career choices were questioned. Innocent moments were reinterpreted through a more suspicious lens. For those pushing the narrative, Andrew's disgrace was not a single scandal, but a key that unlocked a series of truths supposedly hidden in plain sight for years. Whether driven by sincere belief, curiosity, or a thirst for scandal, the online campaign reshaped the conversation almost overnight. Meghan, once again, found herself pulled into a controversy sparked by someone else's downfall. In today's digital world, perception often solidifies faster than facts, and once a story gains speed, corrections struggle to catch up. What remained clear was the impact. The episode served as a reminder of how easily old images can be reframed, how quickly allegations can dominate attention, and how the collapse of one powerful figure can release stories that refuse to stay buried, true or not. So, what do you think about the outcome of the custody deal? Could Meghan and Andrew still have something together? We'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe.